linguistics about. Pardon?
Sorry, that was just my co-president Ben Elby starting the recording.
We tell me when we're okay.
It's all good. Thank you.
Okay, good. So what's linguistics about? Well, about language. What's that? Actually, a good place to start is with Aristotle. Aristotle made a crucial distinction between what he called possession of knowledge and exercise of knowledge. It's kind of interesting if you think about that in the case of language. Each of you possesses a language. It's internal, something coded in your brain somehow. And then you exercise that knowledge in what we're doing right now. I'm exercising it by externalizing my internal thoughts, linguistically expressed thoughts. You're exercising it by hearing some noises and constructing in your minds an image of those thoughts, which, since you speak pretty much the same language I do, we usually manage for my thoughts to be pretty much reproduced in your mind. That's a kind of a miracle. In fact, it tremendously expressed the early founders of modern science. As you know, they were questioning standard verities. Neo-scholastic science had its own answers to all sorts of questions. So a ball drops and steam rises because they're each finding their natural place. You can see a triangle because the form of the triangle moves through the air and implants itself in your brain. Modern science began when scientists, Galileo and others, began to question those statements. They regarded them as invoking what they called occult qualities. They didn't give a real explanation. They attempted to give real explanations. One of the topics that struck their imagination and concern was the core human property, human language. And Galileo and his contemporaries expressed their awe and amazement at the fact that somehow each of us is able to construct in the mind an infinite number of expressions of thought and even go beyond and present those thoughts externally in a way in which others who have no access to our minds can come to perceive and understand our innermost thoughts. And they wondered how this amazing feat could be accomplished. In some ways, that's, I think, one of the most profound comments about language. So we have an internal system, which is our possession of knowledge in Aristotle's terms. We can exercise that the way you and I are doing now, somehow achieving this amazing result that so astounded the founders of modern science, Galileo, his contemporaries, others. Kind of interestingly, all these questions were dropped for thousands of years, mentioned occasionally, but pretty much dropped. You don't find any further discussion of possession of knowledge till recently, the last half of the 20th century. There was a pretty good reason for that. Nobody knew how to capture the concept, possession of knowledge. Everything was discussed was either production or, in the modern period, perception. So structural linguistics, for example, had many achievements, but it never had the concept of possession of knowledge. Well, the modern theory of computation actually made it clear, very clear for the first time, what it meant for a finite system, like what you possess in your brain, to have infinite scope and to be able to construct, generate, in technical terms, an infinite number of expressions, each one the linguistic expression of thought. Some, like the great humanist and linguist Wilhelm von Humboldt, thought that this exhausted possible thought. Others can debate that, but at least this is the aspect of thought that we can discuss and understand. So we know now how a finite device can have infinite generative capacity. In fact, every one of you has one of these on your desk, your laptop. You can put an internal program, you can program your laptop to do something, like say, multiply numbers. And you can give it an input, which is like perception from your keyboard. It'll grind away and give the result of 83 multiplied by 956. Uh, it can also produce, it can be hooked up to a printer, and the printer will externalize what's going on your mind. And notice it can be hooked up to any kind of printer. The internal program doesn't care what printer is used. And there's something similar about language. The internal system that we possess, our internal program for language, doesn't care what output system is used. It's usually the articulatory system, but not necessarily. It's been understood for the last 30, 40 years that sign is virtually identical with spoken language. Same structures, acquired the same way, even neurally coded in the same regions, it seems. So it seems that the internal system is kind of neutral with regard to the printer. Uh, Speech is one way of externalizing what's inside. There are other ways. A touch is a possible way. Uh, well, once we have overcome that gap, we understand the notion of possession of knowledge with an internal system with infinite scope, we can proceed to investigate a number of questions. First question, what is the internal system? The answer to that question, or the goal uh, in trying to answer that question, is what's called a generative grammar. Generative grammar is just a theory of the infinite array of structures generated by the program that you possess and the ways in which it's interpreted as a thought and might be externalized by one or another system. And most of the time, not externalized at all. Most use of language just stays inside. That's what's called inner speech. There is a problem with the production, however. And it's very little studied. Most of the production of this recent study is perception of speech, parsing, uh, machine analysis programs, and so on. Perception is a well-defined problem. It's an input-output system. You have, suppose you're writing a parsing program. There's a text out there. It's like what the keyboard punches into the computer, and then you can figure out how the computer analyzes it. It uses the language that you possess, but it also uses other devices, perceptual strategies, and so on. On the other hand, production is not a well-defined problem for reasons discussed crucially by Descartes shortly after Galileo. Production of speech has what's sometimes called a creative aspect. In Cartesian terms, you may be incited and inclined to produce a certain expression but you're not compelled. Like I could choose right now to start talking about the weather. Okay, I'm not going to do it because that's not what you want to hear, but I could do it. And there's nothing that forces me to give this talk rather than a talk about the weather. Okay. Now that makes production a very hard problem to deal with. In fact, an impossible problem, because no one has any understanding of voluntary action, action that's under our control. So, as when some of the top scientists who work on this recently described it in a state-of-the-art program to MIT's former colleagues of mine, Emilio Bizzi, Roberta Jamian, leading students of the neuroscience of voluntary action. What they said, as they said fancifully, is we're beginning to understand the puppet and the strings, but we know nothing about the puppeteer. We can't say a thing about that. Well, that's one of the reasons why studying production is a very restricted topic. If you look at the literature on it, it's mostly talking about how the articulatory system works, not what's going on in the head. That's out of sight. But we can study the nature of the internal system, the way in which perception of language takes place, and we can learn, especially in recent years, we can ask the question how this internal system gets into your mind. That's the problem of language acquisition. And it turns out to be pretty remarkable that we now know that both from statistical studies of the input to children, the evidence that they have, and from extensive research in language acquisition, turns out that almost everything an infant knows is there to start with. What's acquired in the course of language acquisition is very superficial. The basic structure of language, its principles, the basic meaning of words and phrases, it's all inside. It's just triggered by external stimuli. Some things added, like superficial things, like whether you pronounce the word for that. Sorry, that's one of the problems of working at home. But okay, so you can call that canine dog or some other name, depending on what the triggering is. But apart from that superficial information, seems everything is pretty much there. And when you can barely begin now to study another problem that's been hanging around for a long time. How did the genetic program that yields this capacity evolve? Where did it come from? It's totally unlike anything in the animal world, nothing remotely like it. Okay, animals, no matter how intensively they're trained, say chimpanzees, can't begin to get the rudiments of the system. An infant just acquires it reflexively. It's built to do it. A lot of that remains mysterious, but some of it is beginning to be understood. Well, what kind of properties do we find when we study the internal system? I'll just take to one, which is pretty remarkable as what astounded Galileo and his contemporaries. So it's now known that an infant, experiments have it now down to about 30 months, when the infant has had very little linguistic experience. An infant knows a fundamental property of language, which has the name structure dependence. And it's a very strange property. To illustrate with a standard example, if you hear the sentence, can eagles that fly swim? It could be ambiguous. It could mean, is it the case that eagles that can fly also swim? Or could mean, is it the case that eagles that fly can swim? Fact of the matter, only the second interpretation is possible. Which is a very strange fact if you think about it, because it means that we are ignoring, in fact, the infant is ignoring 100% of what it hears, namely words coming in linear order. That's what you hear. It's ignoring that. It's not interpreting can with the nearest verb, fly. Okay? It's interpreting it with the most remote verb, which happens to be the structurally closest if you look at the structures. But that means that the infant, as I say, it's now down to 30 months, is ignoring everything it hears and paying attention only to what its mind constructs, and it never hears. And this works for all constructions in all languages. It's a deep linguistic universal. We now finally have a proper explanation for it. Turns out to follow from the simplest possible computational device. So if we assume that when language suddenly emerged, and it was sudden for an infinite computational system, it picked the simplest operation. That's what we expect in evolution. And it turns out that many things follow from that, including this curious property. Well, that's the goal, I think, of the serious study of language, is to ask how much can be explained by inquiries of this kind into the core principles, basic properties of computational efficiency, the difference between, crucial distinction between possession of knowledge and exercise of knowledge. In contemporary terms, that's called competence and performance, but it's Aristotle's distinction. Those are the kinds of questions that I think are at the border of research. Of course, there's a ton of work to do to try to find out what are the basic properties of the various languages of the world. And in fact, I should say that as this work proceeds, one conclusion that seems more and more plausible is that there may be only one internal language, maybe uniform or very close to uniform throughout the species. And the apparent variety of languages, the apparent complexity of languages, the quick mutability of languages, changing from one generation to another, turns out more and more that that's in the externalization process, the process of sending the internal program out to a printer, which is, technically speaking, not really part of language. It's part of the amalgam of the internal language and some other system, maybe speech, a system which has no relation to language at all. The articulatory system was in place millions of years before language appeared, and hasn't been modified as it's been used for language. So and the same, of course, is true of the auditory system or the visual system for sign. They're all much deeper in evolutionary history, pretty much shared with other primates, and irrelevant to language. Just those are the printers that are used. The internal system, the one that generates thoughts, might be uniform. It's not demonstrated, but work is pointing in that direction. So maybe if you proceed in this field, you'll discover that it's true. I think it's about on the border of being demonstrated. And that's already suggested by the property of structure dependence. which tells you that the linearization, the fact that the printer is sending out the sentence word after word, is not really part of language. That's just the way the sound system has to work. Our articulatory system can't produce structures, it can only produce sequences of words. So the structures are mapped into that printer, which then the hearer has to reconstruct the structures. Galileo's problem. Well, I think that's roughly, as I see it, where the field stands at the moment, but I'll stop there and let you start to talk.
Thank you so much. Do you want to take questions or should I call on people for you?
As you choose, you pick them.
Okay. Yeah, so please just raise your hands in the participants tab. Um, Arvin Hariri.
Hi. First of all, thanks so much for speaking. This was super insightful from like a understanding linguistics standpoint, because that's not really my background. So again, thanks so much. I was wondering if you're familiar with the works of Daniel Everett, and kind of how Daniel Everett, the linguist who did a lot of famous work with the Piraha people in the Amazon, I feel like his kind of his theory on the universal printer is like very much different from yours, in that like it's not necessarily down to a mutated gene, and it could theoretically, like different people such as the Piraha people develop languages differently, and thus the printer becomes different based on their needs, and so therefore there isn't like this universal backdrop that it comes from. That's the first part of my question. Second part of my question is, well, first part is like, could you speak to that, and like, do you agree or disagree with that? And the second part of the question is, if there is such a universal printer, do you see a future in which there could be like true autonomy of speech, true autonomy of signs, in order to like allow robots to, through machine learning, deep learning, be able to speak exactly as people? And what are the implications of that? Thank you.
Well, first of all, what's universal is not the printer. You can use any printer. You can use speech, you can use sign, you can use touch. Uh, you can't use smell, but that's only because our sense of smell is not sensitive enough to make enough distinctions. The work of Dan Everett was, I'm sorry to say, sorry to be unkind, in the first instance, it was based on just a gross misreading of the literature. As it persists, it becomes basically fraud. The people he's speaking of, the Piraha, have exactly the same faculty of language that we have. That's easily demonstrated. They speak Portuguese perfectly, okay? They have the same faculty of language, the same internal system. Uh, Everett argued that they don't have what's called recursion, an infinite number of expressions. That may be true or false, but it's totally irrelevant. He just misread all the literature, all of it. All of the sources that he cites point out that the infinite capacity of language is part of the faculty of language. It's part of the universal system, which is uh, exemplified in one or another way in particular languages. It's conceivable, though very unlikely, that some specific language doesn't use this capacity. That would be a curiosity. It would be about on a par with finding some tribe somewhere where everybody wears a black patch over one eye, so they're not using binocular vision. That would be of absolutely no interest to somebody studying binocular vision. Similarly, if some language, say Piraha, happened not to use the capacity of recursion, it would be a minor curiosity, nothing. Then comes the point that he's talking about, the cultural factors that lead people to speak one way or another. That varies all over the place. It varies within English. Uh, the group that's meeting here uses English differently than a group of people you can find down in Roxbury in the slums. They're using the same language, but using it differently. Okay, so that's all over the place. It's not an uninteresting topic. You can certainly study the way language is used differently in different groups. It tells you nothing about language. And again, the clear proof of that in the case of his language is they all speak Portuguese. Okay, exactly the same kind of system that we have. So all of this work got enormous amounts of publicity, but it's basically at the very best a triviality, like finding a tribe with patches over one eye. To language, it's irrelevant. Now, when you look at the literature he cites, it's all very explicit about this. It's just a misreading of the literature.
Brandon Kingdollar.
Hey, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. In his book, This Is Your Brain on Music, psychologist Dr. Daniel Levitin posits that language might have evolved from music because there are archaeological finds of musical instruments that seem to predate our earliest known modern languages. And furthermore, like the pitch contours of music track a lot with that of speech. And I was wondering if you think this might be possible and what your perspective on that is.
Well, there's a famous Harvard evolutionary biologist, retired some years ago, named Richard Lewontin, who wrote one of the most important articles on evolution of cognition. I urge you to read it if you haven't. It's in a 4-volume encyclopedia called Invitation to Cognitive Science, published by MIT Press. Lewontin discusses in detail the possibilities of learning about evolution of cognition by any tools available to us. We, of course, don't have tape recordings from 200,000 years ago. If we had them, we'd know a lot more, but we don't have them and we're never going to get them. So given the kinds of evidence available to us, how can the study of evolution of cognition to take place? That includes, in particular, evolution of language. He was very pessimistic. He argued that you're never going to get anywhere. I think he said it's easy to make up stories, what evolutionary biologists call just so stories. You can say, maybe it happened this way, maybe it happened that way. Ton of literature about that. Evolutionary psychology is full of it. He was pretty critical of evolutionary psychology, I should say. He said, you can make up any story you like, but to try to show it is something different. In particular, the case of human language is going to be unusually difficult because there's no comparative evidence. We know a lot about the human visual system because we do invasive experiments, rightly or wrongly, you could argue, but invasive experiments are done with cats and monkeys who have about the same visual system. So you learn a lot about the human visual system that way. Can't do that with language. No other organism has anything remotely like it. So invasive experimentation is out. Comparative evidence is missing because there's no other species that has anything like it. So you have very restricted evidence. Now, going to music and language, there are some interesting points. They go back, the modern study of them goes back to important lectures at Harvard. 40 years ago, Leonard Bernstein gave a remarkable series of lectures, the Charles Eliot Norton lectures, I think it was early 70s. They were very well done, very interestingly. And he opened the question pretty much for the first time. It had been discussed a little before, but he really broke it open. The question of whether music, at least some styles of music, he kept the tonal music, classical tonal music tradition, whether that reflects properties of language. That opened up some serious research. A lot of work was done. Ray Jack and Duff, Fred Leardahl have a book. David Pizetsky, chair of linguistics at MIT, has done interesting work on this. And there are similar properties. The case that you mentioned of prosody corresponding to syntactic structure, that's actually been studied in some depth for the last 60 or 70 years. And there's interesting results. There are some others. Well, one possibility is that the fundamental computational element in language, it's called merge in recent literature, that this fundamental computational element is used both for language and for music and for arithmetic, incidentally. It's the same fundamental combinatorial element that appears in music, in arithmetic. This doesn't tell you anything about the order of evolution. It just says, here's three systems which are unique to humans, universal among humans, which happen to have the same, or at least a similar, computational element at their core. How these things interacted, we're back in Dick Lewontin's territory. No way to find out. Could be that language emerged, and once it was there, the combinatorial element in it was just used for other cognitive systems, like arithmetic and music. It could have been some other way. You can make any guess you like. There's no way to find out. It's one of these completely empty questions. No way to find out. I mean, it's not an unanswerable question. It's just that we can't get the answers because we can't go back a couple 100,000 years and see what happened. Okay, if it was possible to do that, you might have an answer. But there are problems you just can't solve, like probably the problem of voluntary action. And nobody has any idea how to solve that. This is a problem that you sort of know how to solve if you had the possibility of pursuing it, but you don't have that possibility. It's a different kind of unsolvable problem. This incidentally based on a very critical issue in evolutionary theory. You go back to Darwin and Wallace, the two co-founders of the modern theory of evolution. They were both very perplexed about the fact that humans have the capacity for arithmetic. They assumed, they didn't have the evidence, now we have better evidence, they assumed that this is universal among humans, that it's a universal capacity. It's a very plausible assumption because it's impossible to learn it. There's no way to learn the fact that the numbers go on forever. Either you know it or you don't know it. There's no evidence that can tell you that they go beyond 83, let's say, if that's all you've heard. Humans do have it, but it couldn't have been derived by natural selection because it was never used throughout the whole of the hundreds of thousands of years of human existence. Arithmetic was almost never used. Some rudiments of it, small numbers were used. What's called numerosity was used, knowing that 80 things in a bag are more than 60 things. It's called numerosity. But counting and adding and multiplying, they were never used. It's just a tiny part of modern human history for a small sector of the species. So how can we all have it if it never could have been selected? Darwin thought somehow could have evolved by selection. Wallace thought there's some other process involved in evolution beyond selection. We now know there are many other processes involved. Selection is only a small part of evolution, but they didn't know that. Well, one possibility is that arithmetic never evolved at all. What emerged was language. It had a computational element. You apply that computational element, it turns out you get the basis for arithmetic. It's these are all problems on the kind of at the border of study. There's literature on them if you're interested.
Thank you. Moshe Polyak.
Hello, thank you so much. I was reflecting on the difference between humans and other animals. And I was thinking that two ideas emerged for me about the main differences between humans and animals, and that would be language and kind of a higher order cognition, like kind of reason abstractly or plan, executive control, and you mentioned arithmetic. And I was wondering, are all of these manifestations, including kind of abstract reasoning, all manifestations of the same thing, of merge? Or could it be multiple systems that?
Sorry, catch it. Could you say it more slowly?
Yes, I'm sorry. So reflecting on the difference between humans and other animals, I kind of I think about language, and then I think about a bunch of other stuff like higher order thinking skills like arithmetic you mentioned, but also the ability to plan and kind of to reason, to think abstractly. Do you think all of these manifest from kind of same merge or from this language faculty, or are they different? And how could it be that we have these very different things that all make us very separate from animals?
Well, we don't know whether other animals plan, reason, choose. Basically, we have no information about it. So take the two canines at my feet. I don't want to use the word or there'll be a race to the door. There are lots of complicated things they know. Like they can pick out sounds that I make. They don't know their words, but they can pick them out and react in complicated ways. Like I was to say the simple word for canine, there'd be a rush for the door, okay? They can do pretty complicated things. Like it happens, there's a big one and a little one. And the big one steals all the toys. And it knows that we yell at it and tell the little one has to give it back. Well, the big one likes to go out to play. And she's learned that if she steals the toy from the little one, we'll tell her to give it back and she'll ask for a reward. And the reward will be, I'll take her out to play. Okay. So she just purposely steals the toy, then looks at me and expects the next thing. Well, is that planning? It's something, but it has none of the characteristics of human planning. The similarities are extremely superficial. They're very complicated things, but extremely superficial. Maybe we don't know enough about animals. Could be. There's a lot of interesting work on animal cognition, and animals do a lot of interesting things, like crows, for example, corvids, which have incredible memories, can do things way beyond what humans can do. Like a certain species of crows can collect maybe 10,000 seeds and hide them in ways where it remembers their quality. So it will go to the ones which are more likely to deteriorate more quickly. Humans can't do anything remotely like this. And furthermore, there's some evidence that corvids try to deceive others. So if they see another crow looking at where they hide a seed, it's claimed that if the other one goes away, they'll move the seed somewhere else. so that one won't get it. Well, it's kind of planning, but again, at an extremely superficial level. There's no indication that other animals have anything in the same ballpark, even genetic, evolutionarily related to what humans do. What humans do seems to, it's kind of strange fact, but it seems to be totally unique. I should say, you perhaps know about this, that there have been extensive efforts to try to teach chimpanzees or gorillas, the animals kind of closest to us. That's not so close, that's about 12 million years, but the ones 6 million years since the separation. And then of course they both evolved. There have been extensive efforts to do that. Total failure. They can't even acquire the concept of naming something. You know, this is an apple. Can't do that. A lot of the investigators fooled themselves into thinking they were getting results, but when it was analyzed closely, it turned out there was self-suggestion. No, nothing happening. Somebody doesn't like this discussion. That means I'm thinking.
Stefan Fagan Avery.
Howdy. My question mostly revolves around how we distinguish different languages from each other. I know that in the past you have signed an accord about how Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian shouldn't be different languages because they are basically the same language in a sense. But we do have different languages for, we have the same language for different dialects, such as.
Maybe they'll keep quiet. I couldn't hear.
Oh, sorry, I'll repeat what I said. I was wondering about the different way that we categorize languages. Like with, as Adam had shown inside a past meeting in the Linguistic Club, there's 4 languages: Bosnian, Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian, which are almost the same language in a sense, except for a couple of minor differences. But they have the same grammar and they have many of the same words. But we don't consider other kinds of dialects, such as African American, an African American dialect to a usual dialect of English, to be different languages. Why exactly, what is the dividing line between languages in a sense? Is it just how we people distinguish them, or there's something concrete that differentiates them?
I grew up in Northeast Philadelphia, right on the border of an African-American neighborhood. And when I took the trolley car, kids from the neighborhood were sitting behind me. I couldn't understand a word they were saying, and they couldn't understand a word I was saying, but it's the same language. Their language is called non-standard. Actually, mine is non-standard too, closer to standard. But that only has to do with wealth and power. I mean, if all the wealth transferred to those neighborhoods, that would be standard English. There's no difference. It's like the difference between English and French. You know, there was a period in history where if you wanted to be a cultured person, you had to learn French. Today, you want to be a cultured person, you learn English. Okay, has nothing to do with the languages. Has to do with who has the guns and the dollars. Okay, that's not a language problem. The same is true of, there is by now very extensive study of African languages. It's one of the most quickly expanding fields of study, and what you find is what by now we expect. They're essentially the same. Maybe the most striking case where there's some difference is has to do with the languages of what are called the San group in Africa. We sometimes call them pygmies or something like that. They separated, there's now genomic analysis that shows that they separated from the rest of the human species roughly on the order of 150,000 years ago. And all proto-humans at that time were all in Africa, but they separated and moved apart. Remember, these were very small groups at the time. There weren't very many Homo sapiens, small groups until very recently. Turns out that their languages have an interesting difference from other languages. They are the only languages that use what are called clicks. I'm not capable of producing them, but ways of making click-like sounds in your articulatory system. We all have the physical capacity to do that, but we don't use it. And they do in very intricate ways, the kind of complex click systems. So it turns out that the way I was talking about it before, they're using a different printer, slightly different printer. Now, the languages seem to be the same as far as we know, but it has this interesting, striking difference in the way it's articulated. And that's the earliest separation that's known, around 150,000 years. You look at other languages all over the world, you find many apparent differences, but it does seem that it's overwhelmingly in the externalization system. And maybe someday we'll discover entirely there. Wouldn't be a big surprise if we discovered that, incidentally. The reason is what's called poverty of the stimulus. The information available to the infant is far less than what the infant knows, far less. I mean, by now we know that even 2-day-old infants already have a certain amount of linguistic knowledge, which they obviously picked up in utero. A 2-day-old infant can distinguish the language of its mother from some other language, both spoken by a bilingual woman whose voice they've never heard. So it's not familiarity with the voice, it's picking out something about the language. There's been a lot of study of this since it was discovered, probably mostly involving prosodic features, things like pitch and stress and so on. What are called function words, words like of, in, by, and so on, are distinguished from substantive words like, river, tree, cow, and so on, pretty early. Children don't use the function words, but they know them, and they know exactly where they go. Show that by experiment. And the same is true if you look at the meaning of words. The meaning of words, if you look at them closely, they have very complex, intricate meanings, and they're learned almost instantaneously. Main work on this has been done by Lila Gleitman, psycholinguist at Penn, old friend. She's found that children learn words almost on a single presentation. In fact, at the peak periods of language acquisition, say around 2 to 3 years old, the kids are picking up words at about 1 every waking hour. And the words that they pick up, contrary to what used to be believed, have a very intricate somatic structure, but they have no evidence for it, none, just like they have no evidence for the structure preservation, none. But they somehow know you disregard all of the evidence you hear, all of it, 100%, and pay attention only to something you never hear. That's just the way we're designed. And we now, as I said, have good explanation for that in terms of the most elementary principles of computation. I think these are some of the most important results in the history of the field. This is, I must say, most of my colleagues don't agree with this. I'm talking my own view.
Thanks. Yuka Zhang, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
Yeah, that's all right. Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Chomsky, for being here. It's an honor to speak with you. And I was just wondering, so supposing there is a universal structure that all human beings are born with, can you give us some insights as to what that structure looks like and what are the techniques that have been used or can be used to better understand what that structure looks like?
Techniques are just ordinary research in the sciences. You try to explain the phenomena in the simplest possible way that you can. The basic notion seems to be what is the most elementary computational operation. Take two objects, put them together, and you get a new object without changing either of them. It's the simplest possible operation. Okay, it's essentially a binary set formation. That's what it amounts to. It's called merge in the literature. Turns out if you just look at the way merge operates using just principles of general computation, which are independent of language, you get a lot of results. One of the results that comes out is structure dependence. Another that is the inability to use linear order. Another that comes out right away is a strange phenomenon of language that was always considered very puzzling. It's a ubiquitous property of language that they employ what's called dislocation. You hear a word in one position, but you interpret it somewhere else. And so, for example, if I say the boys met the girls, the boys met each other at the beach, it means each other's the boys. Suppose I say the boys expect the girls to meet each other at the beach. Each other refers to the girls, not the boys, closest antecedent. Suppose I say, which girls do the boys expect to meet each other at the beach? It's girls meeting each other, not boys. You don't pick the closest antecedent, you pick the most remote one. And the reason, of course, is that what the mind is hearing is which girls did the boys expect which girls to meet each other at the beach. The mouth is not expressing that. The mouth is observing a general principle of economy, which produces little as possible because it saves lots of computation. Well, when you produce as little as possible, you don't produce the thing that's in the mind, but the mind doesn't know anything about that. It's just hearing the thing that's immediately created. And it turns that that's created by merge. It's easy to show. So we have the property of dislocation and a property that's called reconstruction. There's a lot of literature in the asking how you can reconstruct in a sentence like that, how do you know that which girls is in that position, not in some other position? Well, in this case, it's pretty simple, but if you get complicated sentences, it gets extremely complex. In fact, if any of you have worked on automatic parsing programs, machine parsing, that's the main problem. It's a name for it. It's called filler gap problems. You hear a phrase at the beginning of a sentence, like which girls, you got to find out where it belongs. That turns out to be an extremely complex problem, but it's forced by the simplest possible operations. And there's quite a few other things like that, which fall into place when you look at the simplest computational operation. The study of these topics is, in recent years, called the minimalist program. Now, it's an interesting question to see how far it can go. Can you account for everything in language by keeping to the simplest operations? 20 or 30 years ago, that would have sounded insane. And now it sounds not unreasonable. There's a lot of progress towards it. And if you think about the evolution of language, it's not that surprising that we don't know a lot about the evolution of language for Lewontin's reasons, but there is some information. I already mentioned some. It had to be prior to about 150,000 years ago, because that's when the first known separation took place and the language faculty was already in place. So the San people have the same language faculty we do. So it had to be before 150,000 years. Prior to the appearance of Homo sapiens, there's no evidence for symbolic behavior, complex symbolic behavior. Maybe beads, a few beads on something. After the appearance of Homo sapiens, you get pretty complex symbolic behavior. In fact, 50 or 60,000 years ago, it's indistinguishable from today. Those are very brief periods in evolutionary time, the flick of an eye. So what it looks like is that language emerged pretty much along with Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans. Seems to be just came along with them. But that means, if correct, that it evolved in essentially an instant of evolutionary time. Well, a combinatorial operation that yields an infinite output cannot be acquired step by step. Okay, you can't learn arithmetic by learning how it works up to 7. Then you study a little more, you learn how it works up to 11, and you keep going. It doesn't get anywhere. You have to know from the beginning that it goes on forever. That means you have to have started with some small rewiring of the brain, which produced a computational operation with infinite scope. Well, that has to happen at once. Can't happen in steps. And you can explain a good part of language on the basis of it. Well, all of that, when you put it together, suggests that maybe language emerged pretty suddenly just as an instrument of thought. And Homo sapiens, who underwent that mutation, had capacities that no one else in the animal world had. Then it propagated, small groups, then goes all the way to us without any particular change. There may have been no evolution since the very beginning. And remember, the 200,000 years is nothing in evolutionary time. It's invisible. That's a possibility, and it's possible to move forward on it. So the detailed study of, say, African languages, languages of the Amazon, Papua New Guinea, others, the detailed study of those languages provides extensive information on what the fundamental system might be, what's called universal grammar in modern terms, the genetic endowment for the faculty of language. Well, a lot of this is speculation, but I think these are directions in which a good deal of research is moving.
Christy, Justin.
Hi, Doctor. So I was wondering, like, how you would think about the problem of communicating with, like, an alien species. Like, I would imagine that, like, if a species was able to come to Earth, we would have some version of language. but not necessarily like operating with the same senses that we do. So like, what concepts do you think we should try to translate first, or like, is that the right way to think about this question? Like, just your thoughts in general.
Sorry, I didn't catch it. I only caught a little bit. Could you try again?
Sure. So I was wondering, like, how you would think about the problem of communicating with like an alien species. Like, I would assume the problem of communicating with an alien species.
How do we, I only caught a few words. I think if you move a little bit away from the mic, it might be easier.
So I was wondering how you would think about the problem of communicating with an alien
Problem
species. Communicating.
Don't catch the word.
Of communicating?
Communicating.
No.
The problem of communicating.
Communicating with an alien species.
Other species. Communicating with other species.
Adam, do you mind if I type it up and you read it off?
Are you
I
asking about communication with other species?
with aliens.
Aliens.
Yeah.
Communicating with aliens. Well, that's an interesting question, actually. I have a paper about this. But if you look at the most elementary operations, the operation merge, if you look at it, there's no time to explain it, but in fact, if you take it in its simplest form, the absolutely simplest form, it basically gives you arithmetic. Marv Minsky, one of the founders of artificial intelligence, who worked on the problem of extraterrestrial communication, argued that the thing that we would expect other kinds of intelligence to have is arithmetic. Now we have some reason to expect that with the discovery that the basic elements of arithmetic do derive from the same computational element, the simplest form of the same computational element that yields language. Language uses more complex forms, but the simplest form does give arithmetic. So assuming that some extraterrestrial intelligence evolved a thought system and communication system the way we did, the simplest possible one, assuming, in other words, that Mother Nature made the simplest choice, which is natural, maybe we can communicate with them through arithmetic as a start. That's a possibility. Incidentally, as you probably know of the Fermi paradox, Enrico Fermi asked, he was very surprised. There's the conditions for growth of intelligence are all over the universe. Innumerable cases of planets where it could have developed. How come we're not ever finding any? Well, there's some interesting proposals about that. One of them is by the grand old man of evolutionary biology, Harvard biologist, Ernst Mayr, died a couple of years ago. He argued that there's a reason for it. He argued that there was an interesting debate you might want to look up with Ernst Mayr and Carl Sagan. It must have been about 1990 or so, on the possibilities of higher intelligence in the universe. And Carl Sagan, arguing from the point of view of an astrophysicist, says it's got to be all over the place for essentially Fermi's reasons. And so many possibilities it had to emerge. Ernst Mayr, arguing from the point of view of a biologist, said it's very unlikely that there's any. And his argument was, we have only one example, Earth. On Earth, there have been about 50 billion species. Higher intelligence has not been favored by evolution. The organisms that are biologically successful are the ones who don't have what we call intelligence. So bacteria do great. They're all over the place. They mutate very rapidly. They adapt to whatever happens. Beetles are terrific. They find a single niche. They just stay there. Whatever happens to the world, they stick in that niche and they're around. I think it was Haldane who once said, God must love beetles. You know, they're everywhere. But if you move up the level of what we call intelligence, you get fewer and fewer animals surviving. There aren't very many mammals. In fact, the only reason why there are lots of cows is because we domesticate them. Otherwise, they wouldn't be around. There aren't that many humans. Till very recently, there were very few humans, just sparsely distributed around the world. So his conclusion is, it's not clear, he said, that it's better to be smart than dumb. Maybe it's better to be dumb if you want to be successful biologically. And he concluded maybe just higher intelligence very rarely develops. And if it does develop, it disappears. We're actually in a situation where we're probably proving that. We're very close to destroying ourselves after a very brief period of existence on Earth. So maybe he's right. There's another theory about Fermi's paradox, which I kind of like. It's that there is higher intelligence all over the place. But when they get anywhere near Earth and they see how totally insane we are, they figure we're going to stay away from that crazy place. You know? They would have some reason. But we're in the business of proving it right now. In any event, if there is such a thing, it's very possible that Minsky's idea is correct, that the initial mode of communication could be through arithmetic, which could expand into something like a language. But that's all pretty remote speculation. Actually, Minsky did another experiment which bears on this. If you know what a Turing machine is just a universal computer, basically, kind of like your laptop. It's a computer in which any program can be run. And what Minsky did was, there's a lot of study of the simplest possible Turing machines, fewest states and fewest symbols. And what Minsky and one of his students did back in the 60s was just experiment with the simplest possible Turing machines. Let them run freely and see what happens. Turned out that most of them crashed. They either went into an infinite loop or just terminated. The ones that survived gave the successor function, the basis for arithmetic. So he concluded maybe if Mother Nature does the simplest possible thing, she'll pick something that gives the successor function, which is what you get by the simplest version of merge, the computational core of language. All of this is suggestive. Doesn't prove anything, but it's suggestive.
Nice. Blake Lopez.
Thank you so much for talking with us today, Dr. Chomsky. Related to the origins of language, I noticed earlier you were talking about how on evolutionary timescales, the emergence of language was pretty instantaneous. So I wanted to ask you sort of two related questions. One, do you think that language emerged once, like monogenesis of language, or potentially emerged at several points, polygenesis? And do you think that there was like a proto-language stage before the emergence of full language? And if so, what do you think that might have looked like?
Well, there's a lot of there is a field called evolution of language. And if you look at the literature in the field, almost all of it assumes the existence of a proto-language. I don't see any reason to believe that. Obviously, there's no evidence. There's no evidence for proto-languages. And suppose there were a proto-language, what good would it have done? It's kind of like saying, if you want to build up arithmetic, let's start with proto-arithmetic that only works with numbers less than 100. Doesn't do you any good. To go from 100 to unbounded is no easier than going from 1 to unbounded. Still takes that one single step, okay? So doesn't get you anywhere. So maybe it's true. Again, Dick Lewontin's point comes into operation. No possible way of finding out, but it doesn't do any work even if you assume it. What about monogenesis? Again, we don't know. If language emerged, if it turns out to be true that language developed in the simplest possible way, then if it had developed in separate groups of human beings, it would have turned out to be the same. Okay, so basically the monogenesis question goes back to the viability of what's called the strong minimalist thesis, that language is a perfect outcome of evolution. It's the perfect solution to how to generate an infinite number of thoughts. It's a pretty strong thesis. We're very far from establishing, but there are moves towards it. And if it's true, then polygenesis could be possible, and we'd all basically end up with the same language. Other than that, it's hard to see why there should be differently evolving languages which turn out to be the same. And again, we don't know everything, but as far as we know, there's no difference in language capacity or cognitive capacity generally between humans in different groups. You find a tribe an uncontacted tribe in Papua New Guinea, which hasn't had contacts with other humans for 30,000 years, and take one of the infants to Cambridge. It could be sitting with you in the class. And if one of you had been taken there as an infant, you'd be indistinguishable from the other infants, as far as we know. We don't know, obviously we don't know everything, but the limited evidence available indicates that.
Joanna Boyland.
Afraid I'm gonna have to take off to commitment in a couple minutes.
Okay. So you thank you so much for this. This is slightly in line of what you were just talking about. But Christensen suggests that language evolved to be usable by human minds, including like the hierarchical structure sensitivity, rather than that human minds evolved something like for something else, and then like language took advantage of that aspect of the mind. What do you think about that idea? About like whether language evolved or whether it sort of took advantage of what was already there?
Well, the idea that something evolves for something is a kind of, it's a metaphor. That's not how things evolve. They just evolve. Either they work out or they don't work out, but they don't evolve for anything. Mutation takes place, gives some variation. Either it works out or it doesn't work out. If it works out, it may develop. Then after the development, we can say it evolved for that, but it's not the way evolution takes place. So in the case of language, we don't know why or how, but it seems that on the order of 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, there was some small rewiring of the brain, which yielded the capacity for what's called infinite recursive generation, the generation in the mind of an infinite number of hierarchically structured expressions, each of which is an expression of thought, each of which can be but need not be externalized to one or another sensory motor system. Somehow that happened. Once that happened, it then goes on and develops. But you can't say it developed for the purpose of language or music or arithmetic. They just follow from its having developed. And you look at the design of language, the way it's structured, it seems to be very well designed for expression of thought, but pretty badly designed for communication. So it's used for communication, you're using it, but it's not well designed for communication. Actually, one example, one illustration I already gave, filler gap problems. Language has these gaps all over the place because of reasons of computational efficiency, but they interfere with communication. As I said, that's the hardest problem in parsing. And there are many other things like that. I just take structural ambiguity. Sentences like flying planes can be dangerous. It's ambiguous. Can mean planes that fly or to fly planes. Well, things like that happen all over because language rules just run freely in the optimal way. But they do yield problems with communication. So how do you understand those things? It seems that the structure and design and evolution of language just didn't care about communication. They cared about it. It was just constructing something which is an instrument of thought. Later on, you can figure out ways to externalize it. And as I said, there are some differences, like the click languages externalize it a little bit differently than we do. Deaf people externalize it in vision, using visual space, not auditory space, but it's the same language. Afraid I've
Yeah, thank you.
sorry.
We obviously would love to have you here much longer, but of course you're a very busy person. Thank you so much. Can we get like a round of Zoom applause?
Fun to talk to you. Hope you enjoy the semester.
I appreciate that. And if you're still here, come to our Paul Fromer talk on November 17th. He created the Navi languages in our Avatar, so that'll be fun. All right, well, thank you everybody for coming. That was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.